Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It feels so good to be here in this historic church, the place where Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous Vietnam War speech, deploring the Vietnam War, the site of so much bold truth-telling. This is a place where the truth can be told, the whole truth, a truth born of deep and abiding love for all of us, each and every one of us, including especially all those who have been locked up, locked out, ushered into a parallel social universe, stripped of basic civil and human rights, ushered into a permanent second-class status, all with the expectation that they will remain forgotten. So I want to thank all of you who are here today, who are here to prove that no one, not one of us, will be forgotten, and to join in this movement for justice, a movement that did not begin today or yesterday or last year, but a movement that began when the first slave made his run for freedom, believing that another life was possible, and believing that it was risking all for. I believe that this movement that has laid dormant in many communities for years, I believe it is a sleeping giant that is about to rise again. But before I get carried away here, I want to pause and say a special thanks to a few of the people who made this event possible. Many people ought to be thanked, but I know we don't have time for all of that. So first and foremost, I want to thank Jazz Hayden. Jazz. Where's Jazz? Where are you, Jazz? Jazz contacted me several months ago and told me he had read the book. He had organized a study group comprised of a number of thinkers and leaders from around the city, and that he was answering the call, that he personally was going to see to it that the movement that I call for in the last chapter of the book jumps off right here in New York City. And if anyone is proof that one person can make a difference, it is Jazz. Jazz Hayden is it. He's one of the people that's not supposed to amount to anything, that we collectively are supposed to forget about. But after being released from prison, Jazz refused to be cowed by the shame of the felon label, and he stood tall and devoted himself to the work, the hard work on behalf of all those who have been forgotten, campaigning for voting rights, for parolees, and for felons, and he became the lead plaintiff in a case challenging disenfranchisement of parolees, and now he's spearheaded the organizing effort to make this event possible. Nobody taught him how to do any of this. He is, as they say, making the way by walking. So please give a round of applause to Jazz Hayden. And I also want to thank Reverend Stephen Phelps, the interim senior minister here at Riverside. Reverend Phelps was one of the first people in the faith community, a faith leader, who reached out to me and contacted me after the book was first released. This was before he had come to Riverside. He wrote me and told me that he was deeply moved by the book and sent me a link to an audio recording of a sermon he had delivered based on the book. And I listened to it, and it nearly brought me to tears, and I was blown away, and I immediately wrote him back and said, thank you for giving this book a soul. And Reverend Phelps said, whatever you need me to do in this movement, just say the word. Well, several months later, he comes to Riverside Church, where, quite by coincidence, Jazz Hayden is toiling away with his study group and organizing an event around the new Jim Crow. And I myself don't believe much in coincidences, and so I want to thank God for bringing us all here today to do the work that the freedom fighters who came before us had only just begun. We have our work cut out for us. Appearances in America are very deceiving, lulling people to sleep about what has really been going on. It does look good from a distance. There's Barack Obama, our nation's first black president, standing in the Rose Garden, looking handsome, dignified, and in charge. Flip the channel and there's Michelle Obama, a brown-skinned woman, digging a garden in the backyard of the White House, not as a servant or as a maid, but as the First Lady, schooling the nation on how to be good stewards of our planet and how to take better care of ourselves and our families. Flip the channel again, and there's the whole Obama family exiting Air Force One, descending the flight of stairs, a gorgeous black family living in the White House, ruling America, cheered by the world. Then you drive a few blocks from the White House, and you find the other America. You're wondering what wrong turn was made and how you managed to miss the promised land, though you had reached for it with all your might. A vast new racial undercaste now exists in America, though their plight is rarely mentioned on the evening news. Obama won't mention it. The Tea Party won't mention it. Media pundits would rather talk about anything else. The members of the undercaste are largely invisible to most people who have jobs, live in decent neighborhoods, or zoom around in freeways past the literal and virtual prisons in which they live. Many people are reluctant to admit it, but today, in the so-called era of colorblindness, and yes, even in the age of Obama, something much like a caste system is alive and well in America. The mass incarceration of poor people of color today is tantamount to a new caste system when specifically designed to address the social, political, and economic challenges of our time. It is the moral equivalent of Jim Crow. Now, there was a time, I have to confess, that I rejected this kind of talk. I thought people who made comparisons between mass incarceration and Jim Crow or mass incarceration and slavery were engaging in exaggerations, distortions, hyperbole. In fact, I thought people who made those types of comparisons were actually doing more harm than good to efforts to reform the criminal justice system and achieve greater racial equality in the United States. But what a difference a decade makes. For after years of representing victims of racial profiling and police brutality and investigating patterns of drug law enforcement in poor communities of color and attempting to assist people, quote unquote, re-enter into a society that never seemed to have much use for them in the first place, I had a series of experiences that began what I call my awakening. I began to awaken to a racial reality that is so obvious to me now that what seems odd in retrospect is that I had been blind to it for so long. I state my basic thesis in the introduction where I write, quote, "What has changed since the collapse of Jim Crow has less to do with the basic structure of our society than the language we use to justify it. In the era of colorblindness, it is no longer socially permissible to use race explicitly as a justification for discrimination, exclusion, and social contempt. So we don't. Rather than rely on race, we use our criminal justice system to label people of color criminals and then engage in all the practices that we supposedly left behind. Today, it is perfectly legal to discriminate against criminals in nearly all the ways in which it was once legal to discriminate against African Americans. Once you're labeled a felon, the old forms of discrimination, employment discrimination, housing discrimination, denial of the right to vote, and exclusion from jury service, suddenly legal. As a criminal, you have scarcely more rights and arguably less respect than a black man living in Alabama at the height of Jim Crow. We have not ended racial caste in America, we have merely redesigned it. Now, like I said, I reached this conclusion reluctantly. I resisted it. But over the course of some years, I had an awakening. And there were a number of experiences that helped to open my eyes and admit what was really going on. But one in particular I will never forget. It involved a young African-American man, probably no older than 19. He walked into my office, actually my conference room, one day while I was the director of the Racial Justice Project for the ACLU in California. We had launched a major campaign against racial profiling. We called it the Driving While Black or Brown campaign. It eventually became a national campaign of the ACLU. And we had put up billboards with hotline numbers for people to call if they had, if they believed they had been stopped or targeted by the police on the basis of race. And we had already sued the California Highway Patrol for racial profiling and their drug interdiction practices, but we were planning to sue other law enforcement agencies in the Bay Area as well. And this young man comes into my office. I'm spending my afternoon interviewing one young black man after another who's been stopped, searched by the police for no apparent reason other than race. He comes into my conference room and he's got a stack of papers like this. He has documented a pattern of stops and searches that he's experienced over a period of 9 months with extraordinary detail. He has times, dates, witnesses, names of officers, in some cases badge numbers, extraordinary amount of detail, documenting a pattern of discrimination he'd experienced in his neighborhood. And on top of that, he was a good-looking young man. He was well-spoken and charismatic, and I thought to myself, this is my dream plaintiff. This is the one we've been waiting for. And so I'm talking to him, getting excited, and then he says something that has me pause, and I said, wait, did you just say you're a felon? You're a drug felon? And he gets quiet, and he says, yeah, I have a felony, I have a drug felony, but listen, I was framed, I was set up. The police planted drugs on me, and they beat up me and my friend, and he starts telling me this big, long story about how he was set up, and the police planted drugs on him, and this whole long thing, and I stopped listening. I just said, you know what, I'm sorry, we cannot represent you if you have a felony. The media will be all over you saying, of course the police should be keeping an eye on you because you have a felony, that you're exactly the kind of guy they should be stopping and searching. We can't put you on the stand. They'll use your criminal record against you on the stand. I'm so sorry, but we're not going to be able to represent you. And he becomes increasingly agitated, trying to explain, and then he becomes enraged. And he says to me, you're no better than the police. Minute I tell you I'm a felon, you just stop listening. You can't even hear what I have to say. He says, what's to become of me? I can't get a job. I'm living in my grandma's basement right now because nowhere else will take me in. I can't even take care of myself as a man. I can't even get food stamps today. What's to become of me? What's to become of me? He said, good luck trying to find one young black man in my neighborhood they haven't gotten to yet. They've gotten to us already. You're no better than the police. And he snatches those papers and starts ripping them up. Little pieces, throwing them around the conference room, walking out saying, you're no better than the police. He takes off. Well, several months after that, I'm doing a public access television show in his neighborhood. We were in the process of trying to organize several thousand people to attend a demonstration protesting then Governor Davis's refusal to sign racial profiling legislation. And we were organizing thousands to get on buses and go to this demonstration, so I'm doing a live public access television show out of his neighborhood. And as soon as the show ends, he bursts in